The UAES. Valor, a powerful human warship, moved silently through the vast darkness of space. It was built for war, armed with weapons that could destroy entire fleets. But right now, its mission was not battle, it was investigation. A weak, broken distress signal had reached them from an unknown planet deep in the Andromeda sector. The signal was old, filled with static, but the last words were clear enough to send chills through the crew. "It is hunting us. Stay in the light." Captain Elias Graves, a man who had seen many battles, sat in his command chair, staring at the decrypted message. There were no records of any human colony or research station in that region, so where had the signal come from? The logical decision was to ignore it, to assume it was a malfunctioning beacon from an abandoned ship, but something about the message felt urgent, desperate. He gave the order Valor would investigate. As the warship entered orbit around the planet, the crew realized something was wrong. The planet below was covered in a deep, unnatural darkness. It wasn't like a night sky or the shadow of a storm, it was something more. Even the ship's advanced sensors struggled to scan the surface, as if the darkness itself was absorbing the signals. Lieutenant Mara Hayes, one of the best reconnaissance officers on board, checked her instruments again. The planet's atmosphere was thin but breathable. There was no sign of life, yet the distress signal continued to transmit. Then, without warning, the ship's lights flickered. It was only for a second, but it was enough to put everyone on edge. The engineering team reported no system failures, no external interference. And yet, something felt off. Captain Graves made his decision. A small landing team would go down and find the source of the signal. If there were survivors, they would rescue them. If not, they would retrieve the black box and leave. Mara Hayes led the team, along with scientist Dr. Renard and two heavily armed security officers. Their shuttle descended through thick clouds, struggling to maintain a stable connection with the Valor. As they got closer to the surface, their external cameras failed one by one, leaving them nearly blind. They had to rely on manual controls to land. When the shuttle finally touched the ground, the darkness outside was overwhelming. Their floodlights barely pushed it back, creating eerie tunnels of light in an ocean of black. They stepped out cautiously, their boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The air was cold and still, and there was no sound, no wind, no movement, nothing. Then they saw a facility, hidden in the dark. It was old, its metal walls rusted and covered in deep scratches. The doors were half open, as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned. Inside, the silence was even worse. The halls were empty, the power long gone, but as they moved deeper into the structure, their helmet lights illuminated something terrifying. A message was scrawled across the walls in what looked like dried blood. "Do not let the darkness touch you." Dr. Renard's hands shook as he scanned the message. The distress signal had come from here, but there were no bodies, no signs of life, only abandoned rooms and broken equipment. They found a control room and powered up the emergency systems. Old security footage flickered on the screens. The recording showed researchers, scared and exhausted, talking in hushed voices. "It moves in the dark," one of them whispered. "We thought it was a shadow at first, but it's alive. And it's learning." Then the footage glitched, and for a brief second, something in the shadows moved, a shifting, inky blackness that seemed to swallow a man whole. His screams echoed through the speakers before the screen cut to static. A sudden noise made the team freeze. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper filled the air, coming from the deeper parts of the facility. The sound wasn't human. It was something else, something old. The security officers raised their weapons, their fingers tightening on the triggers. Mara signaled for silence, listening carefully. The whispering stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate creaking sound. It was coming from the entrance. Their shuttle was still parked outside, the only way back to the Valor. But as they turned to leave, the lights flickered again, and for the first time, they saw it. The darkness itself was shifting, moving like a living thing. It wasn't just an absence of light, it was something real, something aware. Mara didn't hesitate. "Move!" she shouted, pushing the team forward. The shadows lunged toward them, stretching unnaturally fast. One of the security officers wasn't quick enough. The darkness wrapped around his leg, pulling him down before anyone could react. He didn't even have time to scream before he was gone. The others ran, their flashlights flickering as the darkness chased them. They reached the shuttle and sealed the doors just in time. Breathing heavily, they looked outside. Nothing. The darkness had retreated, waiting. It wasn't mindless. It was hunting them. Back on the Valor, Captain Graves listened to their frantic report. The team had found no survivors, only warnings left behind by the dead. And yet, the signal was still transmitting. Dr. Renard, shaken but focused, analyzed the last transmission. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. "Captain, the signal isn't coming from the facility. It's coming from somewhere deeper, beneath the surface." Before Graves could respond, the ship's lights flickered again. The transmission on the main screen distorted, and a single message appeared, typed in real time, as if something or someone was sending it directly to them. "It knows you're here." The U.A.S. Valor floated in orbit above the dark planet, its massive engines humming softly in the silence of space. Inside the command center, Captain Elias Graves stood with his arms crossed, staring at the distorted distress signal on the main screen. The transmission was weak, filled with static, but one thing was clear: it was coming from beneath the surface. Lieutenant Mara Hayes and her team had barely escaped the abandoned research facility on the planet's surface, but they had found no survivors, only warnings scrawled across the walls in dried blood. The words still echoed in Mara's mind: "Do not let the darkness touch you." She sat in the debriefing room, catching her breath, while scientist Dr. Renard analyzed the new data. The signal hadn't come from the facility, as they had first thought. It was coming from deep underground, and whatever was sending it was still alive. But something else was bothering her. Ever since they had returned to the ship, something felt different. The Valor was a state-of-the-art warship, yet the lights had flickered twice on the way back. The ship's AI had registered minor system failures, but the engineers had found no cause. And then there was the whispering. Mara had heard it first when she was alone in the locker room, removing her gear. A faint, almost human voice just behind her ear. But when she turned, there was no one there. At first, she told herself it was just exhaustion, a trick of her mind after the terrifying encounter on the planet. But then another crew member mentioned it, in passing an engineer working near the power core. "It sounded like someone calling my name," he had said, shaking his head. But there was no one there. That was when Mara knew something was wrong. She rushed to the control room, where Captain Graves and Dr. Renard were still reviewing the distress signal. "We have a problem," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Something came back with us." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. Dr. Renard hesitated, then turned the volume higher on the distress signal. It was nothing but static at first, but then, hidden beneath the noise, they all heard it: a whisper. Not a recorded message, not an automated distress call. It was a voice, faint and distorted, speaking words that made no sense. Graves narrowed his eyes. "Amplify it," he ordered. Renard hesitated but obeyed, adjusting the filters. The static faded slightly, and the whisper became clearer. "You brought it with you." A cold chill ran through the room. No one spoke for a long moment. Then the ship's alarms went off. A power fluctuation had hit the lower deck, cutting off the lights in one of the maintenance corridors. Engineering teams were already responding, but Mara had a sinking feeling in her gut. "We need to check that area now," she said, already moving. Graves nodded and followed, with Dr. Renard close behind. The corridor was dimly lit by emergency lights, the main power offline. The engineers were confused. There were no malfunctions in the system, no reason for the sudden outage. But the air was heavy, thick with something unseen. Mara stepped forward cautiously, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Then she heard it again. A whisper. This time, it was clearer than before. It came from the far end of the corridor, where the shadows were deeper, unnatural. Mara. Her blood turned cold. Her name. It had spoken her name. She raised her weapon instinctively, scanning the corridor, but there was nothing there. Just empty space. Graves reached for his communicator. "Security, report to lower deck immediately." But before he could finish, the lights flickered again, and for the briefest second, they saw it. A shape, formless, shifting, moving in the darkness. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even solid. It was a shadow, but it was alive. And it was watching them. The emergency lights flickered again, and suddenly, one of the engineers screamed. Mara turned just in time to see him being pulled backward into the darkness. There was no struggle. No time to react. He was there 1 second, and then he was gone. The other engineers ran, panic in their eyes, and Graves fired his weapon blindly into the shadows, but the bullets hit nothing. "Move!" he shouted, pushing Mara and Renard back toward the exit. They ran, their footsteps echoing through the metal corridor, the whispering growing louder behind them. It wasn't one voice anymore. It was many. Countless voices, overlapping, speaking in a language that was both alien and terrifying. They reached the elevator and slammed the emergency override, the doors closing just as the darkness reached them. As the lift ascended, the whispering didn't fade. It followed them. It was inside the ship now. Back in the command center, the situation was getting worse. More power failures, more missing crew members. The ship's AI was malfunctioning, unable to explain the anomalies. But the worst part was the distress signal. It was no longer coming from the planet. It was coming from the Valor itself. Graves stood in the center of the room, his mind racing. This wasn't just a ghost story or a malfunction. They had brought something back with them, something that shouldn't exist in this universe. And now it was spreading. Mara stared at the screen, her breath shallow. "What do we do?" she asked. Graves clenched his jaw. "We need to contain it. If we can't let it reach another ship." The implications were clear. If they failed, they would have to destroy the Valor to stop whatever was now inside it. But before they could make a plan, the lights cut out completely, and the whispering surrounded them from all sides. Then, in the pitch-black darkness, the voices spoke as one. "You cannot escape." The U.S. Horizon drifted silently through deep space, its engines humming as it moved toward a routine cargo inspection mission. Captain Daniel Rains sat in his command chair, reviewing reports, while his crew carried out their usual tasks. The ship had been in operation for years, a reliable vessel with a disciplined team. But something strange had been happening over the past few days, things that couldn't be explained. Crew members reported hearing voices in empty corridors. Tools went missing, only to reappear in places they had never been. The ship's AI had flagged minor inconsistencies in the crew manifest, but every time Rains checked, the numbers were correct. Still, a sense of unease crept through the halls like a cold whisper. It wasn't until Engineer Lewis disappeared that the real panic began. He had been working alone in the lower maintenance bay, repairing a minor coolant leak. His communicator remained active, transmitting only silence when his team tried to reach him. When security arrived at his last known location, all they found was his tools scattered across the floor. There were no signs of struggle, no damage, nothing. It was as if he had simply stopped existing. Captain Rains ordered a full search of the ship, but after hours of scanning every deck, there was no trace of Lewis. The ship's security footage should have recorded everything, but when they checked the logs, the section covering the maintenance bay was completely corrupted. Not blacked out, not erased, just pure static. Tensions rose among the crew. People whispered about ghosts, about something moving in the unseen corners of the ship. Rains dismissed the rumors, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then the second disappearance happened. Officer Patel was last seen in the mess hall, joking with 2 crew members. She got up to leave, walking toward the exit, but she never arrived at her next station. Security reviewed the footage. One frame showed her walking down the hall, the next she was gone. Not a single trace remained. It was as if the ship had swallowed her whole. Fear spread through the horizon like a virus. Crew members refused to be alone. They walked in pairs, whispering about an unseen force watching them. Some claimed they felt something standing behind them, just out of sight, only to turn and find nothing. The ship's AI, usually efficient and precise, began making errors. It would call out names of crew members who were no longer on board, list room assignments that didn't exist. Rains himself began experiencing strange lapses. He would walk into a room, certain he had heard voices inside, only to find it empty. He started to doubt his own memory, his own perception of reality. Then, overnight, 4 more crew members vanished. No one had seen them leave their quarters. Their beds were untouched, their personal belongings undisturbed. But they were gone, as if they had never been there at all. Desperate for answers, Rains ordered a full diagnostic of the ship. Dr. Evelyn Carter, the ship's lead scientist, led the investigation. What she found made no sense. The Horizon had a crew of 75 when they left dock, but the logs now claimed the original number had been 70. The missing 5 had never existed according to the ship's records. They were nothing but errors. Yet the remaining crew remembered them, remembered working alongside them, laughing with them, sharing meals. But the ship itself had erased them, rewriting history as if they had never been there. Dr. Carter proposed a terrifying theory. "It's not just taking them," she said, voice shaking. "It's erasing them from reality." Whatever was happening wasn't just an abduction. It was something worse, something that altered time, memory, existence itself. The ship wasn't just losing people. It was losing the very record of their lives. If it continued, there would come a point where none of them would remember they had ever been more than a skeleton crew. Panic set in. People refused to sleep, afraid that if they closed their eyes, they would wake up to find themselves erased. The ship's emergency beacons were activated, sending distress calls into the void, but there was no response. And then, one by one, the lights on the ship began to flicker. It started in the lower decks, entire sections plunged into darkness. The whispering grew louder. The air itself felt wrong, as if reality was beginning to thin. Rains gathered the remaining crew in the command center, determined to fight, but deep down, he knew they weren't fighting an enemy that could be stopped with weapons. Then, in the middle of the briefing, the lights went out completely. The emergency systems activated, casting the room in a dim red glow. The whispering grew deafening, voices overlapping in a language no one understood. Someone screamed. Rains turned, just in time to see Officer Delgado reach for his gun, only for his body to flicker like a broken hologram. 1 second he was there, the next gone. The whispering stopped. The room was silent. And when Rains turned back, he realized something even worse. The crew standing beside him looked confused. Who screamed? Someone asked. No1 remembered Delgado. Rains felt the breath leave his lungs. This was it. It wasn't killing them. It was making them never exist. And soon, there would be no one left. He turned to Carter, the only person who still looked terrified. "How do we stop it?" he demanded. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could answer, her face twisted in horror. She looked down at her own hands as they began to blur, her form flickering, like she was being erased right in front of them. "Remember me," she whispered. And then she was gone. Rains gasped, gripping the console, his heart hammering. He turned to his crew, but there were fewer faces now. The ones who had been standing there moments ago were missing. And worse, he could feel the knowledge of them slipping from his mind, like sand through his fingers. He fought to hold on, to remember, but the more he tried, the more they faded. He was running out of time. The AI's voice crackled over the speakers, monotone and emotionless. Crew count 1. Mission status operational. Rains staggered back, looking around the empty command center. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. The ship was silent. The crew was gone. He reached for the console, trying to send one last distress signal, but there was no one left to answer. The U.A.E.S. Revenant drifted through deep space, its massive structure cutting through the endless void. It had been on a routine patrol when the distress signal came, a weak transmission from an unknown source, buried deep within the asteroid field ahead. Captain Adrian Holt studied the signal carefully. It was scrambled, barely readable, but one phrase stood out: "Do not enter the dark." The warning made no sense, but protocol required them to investigate. A small team was assembled: Lieutenant Sarah Voss, Engineer Carter Wells, and Security Officer Dwayne Riker. They boarded the shuttle and moved toward the signal's origin, unaware that their fate had already been sealed. The asteroid field was unnervingly quiet. Large, jagged rocks floated aimlessly, illuminated only by the faint glow of distant stars. As the shuttle weaved between them, the source of the distress call came into view: an abandoned research station, barely clinging to the surface of a massive asteroid. Its lights flickered weakly, the exterior battered and scarred. It looked dead. The docking bay opened without resistance, as if inviting them in. The moment they stepped inside, a strange silence enveloped them. The air smelled stale, untouched for years, yet there was no dust, no sign of decay. The station's interior was intact, as if the crew had simply walked away mid-task. Half-eaten meals sat on tables. Tools lay scattered on the floor. Terminals still hummed with power. But there was no sign of life. Voss checked her scanner. "No bodies," she muttered. "No movement. Just emptiness." Wells moved toward a control panel, trying to access the station's logs. The screens flickered, static distorting the display before a corrupted message appeared. It was a final transmission, heavily degraded. A man's face flashed on screen, his eyes wide with terror. His voice was weak, desperate. "It lives in the dark. Do not let it touch you. Do not." The message cut out. Then, without warning, the station's lights flickered violently. A deep, unnatural hum vibrated through the walls, and a chilling wind swept through the room, though there were no vents open. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, stretching unnaturally. Riker raised his rifle, eyes scanning the room. "Something's wrong," he said. "We need to leave. Now." Before anyone could respond, the lights cut out completely. Darkness swallowed everything. The only illumination came from their suit helmets, casting weak beams into the inky blackness. The silence was deafening. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing from the far end of the corridor. Voss turned sharply, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" She called out, but there was no answer. The shadows seemed to breathe, shifting, moving without form. Then, a whisper. Soft, almost gentle, but undeniably wrong. "You should not have come." A cold shiver ran down Wells' spine. His fingers trembled as he tried to reactivate the station's emergency lighting, but the system refused to respond. Panic crept into his voice. "Something is in here with us." Then, Riker screamed. The others turned their flashlights toward him, but he was already gone. His rifle clattered to the floor, spinning across the metal surface. Voss rushed forward, searching the space where he had just been standing, but there was nothing: no blood, no body, only the whispering growing louder. The shadows coiled and stretched, closing in. Captain Holt's voice crackled through their comms. "Team, report. What's happening down there?" Voss tried to steady her breathing. "We lost Riker," she whispered. "Something took him." Holt's voice hardened. "Get back to the shuttle. Now." They turned to run, but the darkness moved with them. The corridor ahead was impossibly long, stretching far beyond its actual dimensions. The doors they had come through were no longer there, only blackness. Their flashlights dimmed, their power draining faster than it should have. Wells fell behind, fumbling with his equipment. "My suit's failing," he gasped. "I can't." A shadow wrapped around him. For a brief second, Voss saw something in the dark, featureless, shifting like living smoke. It reached for Wells, and he let out a strangled cry before being pulled backward into nothingness. His scream echoed through the corridors, then silence. He was gone. Voss stumbled, her breath coming in panicked gasps. Only she remained now. She turned in circles, her flashlight flickering. No, 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 no. Her mind raced. If she stopped moving, she would disappear like the others. She had to keep going. The whispering grew deafening. "Trapped. You are trapped." Her knees nearly buckled. It wasn't just a voice. It was inside her head, inside her thoughts, filling every corner of her mind. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to move. She ran blindly through the endless corridors, her breath sharp and ragged. Then light. A sliver of it, shining through a barely open door. She sprinted toward it, slamming into the metal frame and forcing her way through. The moment she crossed the threshold, the whispers stopped. She was inside the shuttle. The station was gone. Captain Holt's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Voss, what the hell happened?" She stared out the window, her hands shaking. The asteroid was still there, but the station, the place they had just been inside, was gone. As if it had never existed. The distress signal had vanished too, no longer appearing on the ship's scanners. Voss could barely find her voice. "They're gone," she whispered. "Riker. Wells. They're gone." Holt hesitated, his tone unreadable. "Who?" Her breath caught in her throat. "No, no," she muttered, checking the shuttle logs, the crew manifest. But their names were missing. The Revenant's records showed only 2 crew members on the mission, herself and an unnamed officer who had died years ago. Riker and Wells had been erased, like they had never existed. She gripped the console, her mind spiraling. Had she imagined them? Had she been alone this entire time? Then, as she stared at the empty void, a final whisper brushed against her ear. "You were never meant to leave." The alarms blared through the corridors of the U.A.E.S. Exodus, flashing red lights casting eerie shadows against the metallic walls. Commander Ethan Cole ran through the dimly lit passage, his breath heavy, his heart pounding. The ship was breaking apart, its systems failing one by one, and the last surviving crew members were scrambling for an escape. What had started as a simple exploration mission had turned into a nightmare beyond comprehension. Something had boarded their ship, something that was neither alive nor dead, something that hunted in the silence and consumed everything it touched. Cole reached the command center where the remaining survivors, Dr. Emily Rhodes, Lieutenant Harris, and Engineer Park, were desperately trying to regain control. Emily's hands trembled as she worked on the emergency launch system, sweat dripping down her forehead. "We need to get to the escape pods," she gasped. "The main engine is failing. We have maybe 10 minutes before the whole ship collapses." Harris turned to Cole, his voice low but urgent. "It's still here, isn't it?" He didn't need an answer. They all knew. It had been stalking them for hours, appearing and disappearing through the dark, moving between shadows like it was a part of them. It had no form, no face, no voice, only a presence that sent waves of cold terror through the ship. They had seen their crewmates vanish into nothingness, their screams cut off mid-breath. Whatever this thing was, it didn't kill. It erased. Cole steadied himself, gripping his rifle tighter, though he knew bullets wouldn't stop it. "We stick together. No one separates," he ordered, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at his throat. "Emily, get that door open." She nodded, fingers flying over the console as she bypassed the failing security systems. The ship groaned beneath them, metal twisting and cracking under the growing pressure. The emergency lights flickered, and for a brief moment, everything went dark. A chilling silence fell. Then, a whisper, soft, distant, yet deafening in the stillness. "You cannot leave." The lights returned, but Park was gone. Emily let out a choked gasp. No. No. He was right here. She spun around, searching the space where he had been standing, but there was nothing, no trace, no sound, as if he had never existed. The horror in Harris' eyes was undeniable. "We have to move," he urged, pulling Emily away from the console. Now they ran. The corridors stretched endlessly ahead of them, twisting, shifting, as if the ship itself had become a labyrinth. The whispers followed, growing louder, closer, wrapping around them like unseen hands. "You belong to the dark. There is no escape." The escape pods were just ahead. Cole slammed his hand on the control panel, forcing the door open. The small metallic pods sat waiting, their last chance for survival. "Get in," he shouted. Emily and Harris rushed inside, their faces pale with terror. As Cole turned to follow, the shadows moved. Something cold brushed against his arm. His vision blurred. Memories shifted. For a second, he forgot why he was running. He forgot the ship, the mission, the people. The world around him faded, replaced by something vast, empty, endless. He felt himself being pulled into it. A hand grabbed his wrist. Emily. Her face was twisted with determination, her grip like iron. Ethan, fight it. She screamed. Get in the pod. NOW. The haze lifted, and the terror came crashing back. With a final burst of strength, he threw himself into the escape pod. The doors slammed shut, sealing them inside. Harris didn't waste a second. He hit the launch command, and the pod ejected from the Exodus, hurling them into space. Through the small window, they watched the ship crumble, folding into itself, vanishing piece by piece as if being devoured by the darkness. The whispers faded, replaced by the cold silence of the void. The Exodus was gone. So was the thing inside it. For a long moment, no one spoke. They were alive. But then Emily turned to Cole, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan, where's Harris? He froze. Harris had been there. He had launched the pod. But now, only his empty seat remained. There was no sign of him. No memory of his last words. It was as if he had never been there at all. Cole felt the ice-cold realization settle in his chest. They had escaped, but the darkness had taken something with it.